There is a law running beneath every single moment of your life right now. And the terrifying part is that it has been working against most people without them ever knowing it existed. I want you to think about a loom. Not a small one, an enormous one, stretching in every direction as far as the eye can see, weaving in absolute silence. Every thread on that loom is a life. Every intersection of threads is a moment, a decision, a consequence. And here is the part that stopped me cold the first time I truly understood it. Pull one thread, just one, and everything connected to it shifts. Not some things, everything. The whole pattern adjusts, quietly, precisely, without asking your permission. Most people walk through their entire lives staring at the surface of that tapestry. They see the beauty or the ugliness of the pattern directly in front of them, and they spend their energy reacting to it, praising the beautiful parts, cursing the broken ones. They never once ask who is holding the shuttle. They never once wonder what is producing the pattern in the first place. I used to be one of those people. I remember standing in my kitchen very early one morning, the kind of early where the sky outside is still that deep, bruised purple before the sun commits to rising. I had a cup of coffee in my hand that I never drank. It just went cold while I stood there, and I was staring at the wall, not because there was anything interesting on it, but because I genuinely did not know what had happened to my life. Everything I thought I had built carefully, steadily, with effort and intention had come apart. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a sweater unravels when you pull a single loose thread. Slowly at first, then all at once. And the word that kept moving through my mind like a fog was the worst possible word a person can believe about themselves. Lucky. Or rather, unlucky. I had started to believe that some people are simply dealt better cards, that the universe had a preference and I was not it. But I was wrong. And understanding exactly how wrong I was changed the direction of everything. The mechanism running beneath the surface of reality is not random. It is not indifferent. It is not cruel. It is precise in a way that is almost uncomfortable to sit with once you see it clearly. Because precision means accountability. And accountability means that the tapestry you are living inside right now is not something that happened to you. It is something that, in ways you may not yet be able to see, you have been weaving yourself. Thread by thread, thought by thought, choice by choice. Now I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing someone says to make themselves feel powerful, or worse, to make someone who is suffering feel blamed. That is not what this is. This is something far more serious and far more useful than a comforting idea. This is a law, and laws do not care whether you believe in them. Gravity did not wait for Newton to believe in it before it started working. What I am going to share with you is not philosophy for its own sake. It is a map of the mechanism that governs every experience in your life, every relationship, every pattern of success and collapse, every recurring theme that keeps showing up no matter how many times you try to start fresh. And once you have this map, you cannot unsee it. The fog lifts, the pattern becomes visible, and visible patterns can be changed. We are just getting started. And what comes next is the part that genuinely shook me to my foundation when I first understood it. So stay with me. Friends, if this is already making you think differently, please subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most. Now, I need to tell you about a man named Daniel. I met Daniel through a mutual friend at a small gathering in the back room of a bookstore. The kind of place that smells like old paper and wood polish, where the shelves are packed so tightly the spines of the books press against each other like commuters on a train. He was sitting in the corner with a glass of water, not talking to anyone, and there was something about his stillness that was different from shyness. It was the stillness of a person who has recently experienced something that has knocked all the small talk out of them. Within that same year, Daniel had lost his business. The partnership he had spent 6 years building had collapsed, and his health had started sending signals he could no longer ignore. 3 separate catastrophes, 3 completely different areas of life. And from every angle, it looked like a man being targeted by an exceptionally creative universe. I sat down next to him and asked how he was doing. Not the polite version of that question, the real one. And he looked at me with this expression I have never forgotten, somewhere between exhaustion and a kind of confused anger. And he said, "I did everything right. I genuinely cannot explain what happened." But across the room that evening was an older man named Marcus, quiet, unhurried, with the kind of calm that does not come from having an easy life, but from having understood a difficult one. He had spent decades studying the ancient principles that govern human experience, not as an academic exercise, but as a practical science. And at some point during that evening, Marcus sat down across from Daniel, looked at him steadily, and said something that seemed almost too simple to matter. He said, "Nothing that arrived for you this year was born this year." Daniel stared at him. I watched it happen from across the room. I watched the confusion move across his face, and then something else, something slower and more unsettling, begin to surface underneath it. Because somewhere, beneath the exhaustion and the anger and the genuine bewilderment, a part of Daniel already knew that Marcus was right. And that knowledge, that first crack of recognition, was the most important and most uncomfortable thing that had happened to him all year. Because it meant the story he had been telling himself, the story about bad luck and an indifferent universe, was not the true story at all. And the true story was about to ask a great deal more of him. Every painful thing in your life has a birth certificate, and somewhere inside you, you already know exactly where it was signed. That sentence landed on Daniel like something physical. I watched it happen. Marcus said it quietly, without drama, the way you state something that simply does not require performance to be true. And Daniel sat there in that bookstore with the low, warm light pressing down on the shelves around them, and for a long moment he said absolutely nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because something in his chest had just shifted, the way a door shifts when someone finally puts a key in it from the right side. Here is what Marcus walked him through that evening, and what I have spent a long time thinking about since. Every effect has a history. Not a mystery, a history. The business collapse did not begin the morning the numbers stopped working. It began years before, in a pattern Daniel had mistaken for strength. He had a habit of ending conversations before they became uncomfortable, of walking away from tension rather than moving through it, of burning a bridge and telling himself he was simply cutting out what no longer served him. It looked like decisiveness. It felt like confidence. But what it was actually doing, quietly and consistently, was dismantling the web of trust that every real business is built on. Not all at once, thread by thread, until one morning the weight of the structure had nothing left to hold it. The partnership collapse followed the same fingerprint. Daniel had ignored 3 separate moments where his partner had tried to surface a problem. Not aggressively, not with ultimatums. Carefully, the way people do when they still believe in something but are beginning to lose faith that the other person does too. Daniel had heard those conversations and filed them underhandled, not because they were, but because sitting inside the discomfort of them was something he had never learned to do. And so the problem grew underground, the way things do when they are deprived of air and attention, until it became too large to ignore and also too late to fix. His health followed last, because the body is always the final messenger. It delivers the letters that the mind refused to open. None of this was fate. None of it was the universe punishing a good man for reasons he could not understand. It was cause and effect, operating with the quiet precision of a clock. The causes had been planted years before. The effects had simply arrived on schedule. And here is the part that changes everything. The part that takes this from being a painful story about one man in a bookstore and turns it into something that belongs to all of us. Daniel is not unusual. Daniel is not a cautionary tale about exceptional failure. Daniel is what happens when a person moves through life reacting to effects without ever examining the causes. And almost every person alive is doing exactly that, to some degree, right now. Think about the patterns in your own life, the recurring ones, the relationship that always seems to reach the same wall, the professional situation that keeps arriving in a different costume but with the same ending. The version of yourself that shows up under pressure and does the thing you promised yourself you would stop doing. These patterns are not evidence of bad luck. They are evidence of unexamined causes, still running, still producing, still delivering their effects right on schedule. The question is not, why does this keep happening to me? The question is, what did I set in motion that keeps arriving here? And that question, as simple as it sounds, is one of the most difficult things a person can genuinely sit with, because it requires you to look back not with blame, but with honesty. Not to punish yourself for the past, but to understand it well enough to stop repeating it. That distinction matters more than almost anything else I could tell you. Marcus told Daniel something that stayed with me when I heard it later. He said that most people treat their past like a foreign country, somewhere they visited once, that has nothing to do with where they are standing now. But the past is not a foreign country. It is the ground beneath your feet. You are standing on it right this second. And if you do not know what is in that ground, you cannot understand what is growing from it. Daniel spent a long time that night not talking, just sitting with his coffee going cold, which seemed to be a theme in his life lately. And what was happening behind his eyes was something I recognized because I had felt it myself once. The particular discomfort of a map beginning to form where there had only been fog. But here is what nobody tells you about the moment the fog starts to lift. It does not feel like relief, not at first. It feels like a heavier kind of weight. Because as long as it was luck, as long as it was fate, as long as it was the indifferent universe dealing bad cards, there was nothing Daniel could have done differently. He was a passenger. Passengers are not responsible for where the vehicle goes. But if the causes were his, then so was the responsibility. And responsibility, real responsibility, is not a comfortable thing to pick up for the first time. What comes next is where the story goes somewhere most people are not prepared for. Because Marcus had not yet told Daniel the part about where causes actually begin. Not in actions, not even in decisions, but somewhere much earlier, much quieter, and much harder to see without knowing exactly where to look. What Marcus explained next completely reordered the way I understand the relationship between a human mind and the life it produces. And once you hear it, the word coincidence will never feel the same again. Your thoughts are not a commentary on your life. They are its construction crew, and most people have no idea what their crew is building. Marcus said this to Daniel, and I remember Daniel telling me about it later, how that sentence hit him somewhere between his ribs, not painfully, but with a kind of blunt precision, the way a doctor taps a knee and the leg moves before you decide to let it. Because we all carry this comfortable assumption that our thoughts are the response to our circumstances, that we think what we think because of what is happening around us. Marcus was saying the opposite. He was saying that what is happening around you is, in large part, the delayed output of what has been happening inside you. Let me give you the image Marcus used, because it has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else from that conversation. He asked Daniel to picture a master sculptor, not someone chipping away at stone in real time, reacting to whatever the surface shows, but someone who, before a single tool touches the material, has already built the complete statue inside his mind. Every curve, every shadow, every place where the stone will give way to air. The physical work is almost secondary. What the sculptor is doing with his hands is simply catching up to what already exists in his imagination. The mental version of the statue is the first cause. The marble version is the effect. Your mind works the same way. Every sustained thought you carry, every habitual emotional state you return to, every quiet intention running beneath your conscious awareness, these are not reactions to your reality. They are its blueprint. The life you are living right now is the marble version of a mental statue you began carving a long time ago, mostly without realizing you were doing it at all. Daniel sat with that for a moment and then said something honest. He said that if that was true, then his mental statue must have been built by someone with a very dark imagination. Because the life he was looking at did not look like anything he had consciously chosen. And Marcus smiled at that, not unkindly, and said that this was exactly the point. Conscious is the key word. Most of what we build mentally is not conscious. It runs underneath, in the basement of awareness, powered by patterns we inherited, fears we never examined, beliefs we absorbed so early we forgot they were ever installed. You do not have to deliberately think a fearful thought for fear to be operating as a cause in your life. It only has to be the dominant frequency, the background hum your whole system runs on. Think about what that means in practice. Daniel had never once sat down and decided to sabotage his business. He had never chosen to push people away. But underneath the confident surface, Underneath the decisiveness he was proud of, there was a very old and very quiet belief that closeness was dangerous. That letting someone see the full picture, the uncertainty, the moments of doubt, would give them something to use against him. That belief was not a thought he was aware of having. It was more like the temperature of a room. You stop noticing it because you have been in it so long. But it was shaping every decision, coloring every conversation, creating a version of events, again and again, that confirmed itself. That is what Marcus meant by the mind being the plane of primary causation. Not the surface mind that makes lists and plans meetings, the deeper one, the one that runs the emotional weather of your inner world and radiates that weather outward into every interaction, every choice, every pattern that keeps arriving in your life with the reliability of a scheduled train. And here is what makes this both confronting and extraordinary at the same time. If unconscious thought is the cause, then conscious thought is the solution. Not positive thinking in the shallow sense of that phrase, not pasting optimistic words over a fearful foundation, but the deep, patient, honest work of examining what is actually running and choosing, deliberately, what you want to run instead. That is the sculptor reclaiming the studio. Daniel did not fully grasp the scale of what Marcus was describing that night. Neither did I when I first heard it. It takes time for something that large to become real to you. But what Daniel did feel, sitting in that bookstore with the smell of old paper around him and the quiet street outside beginning to empty as the evening got late, was a shift, small but distinct. The shift from feeling like a passenger to feeling like there might be a steering wheel somewhere, one he had simply never been shown how to find. But then I asked Marcus the question that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the beginning of this conversation. If the mind is the origin of all causes, I said, then why does chance feel so real? Why does the random, the unexpected, the totally unpredictable feel so undeniably present in everyday life? Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Let me show you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single coin. He held it between his fingers and said, "Tell me, when this lands, is it chance?" I said, "Yes, obviously. You cannot know which side will come up." He said, "You cannot know. That is a different thing entirely." And that distinction is where most people spend their whole lives confused. What he explained next dismantled something I had believed so completely I had never once thought to question it. And it started with something far simpler than a coin. It started with the weather. There is a particular kind of storm that forms over warm coastal water, the kind that arrives suddenly, that seems to come from nowhere, that catches people off guard and rearranges everything in its path. From the outside, standing on a beach watching the sky turn that strange greenish gray, it feels like the world has simply decided to do something unexpected, random, unannounced. But Marcus explained that the storm had been building for days before anyone on that beach could see it. The water temperature had reached a precise level. The pressure systems above had arranged themselves into a specific configuration. The humidity and wind direction had aligned in a way that made what followed not just possible, but inevitable. Every meteorologist with the right instruments and enough data could have told you 3 days earlier exactly what was coming, when it would arrive, and how strong it would be. The storm was not random. It was the product of a chain of causes so numerous and so spread out that no single person standing on the beach could track them all. And because they could not track them, they called it unpredictable. They called it sudden. Some of them, if they were the type, might even call it bad luck. But the storm did not care what they called it. It arrived exactly when the causes said it would. Now, apply that to your own life. Think about the last thing that felt truly random, the opportunity that appeared from nowhere, the relationship that ended without warning, the moment when everything seemed to shift direction without explanation. What if it was not without explanation? What if the explanation was simply longer than you expected and started earlier than you were looking? Marcus placed the coin flat on the table between us, tail side up, and said that in a world where every cause produces an effect, the word chance is just the name we give to causes we have not yet learned to see. And then he said something that made Daniel go very quiet for the second time that evening. He said, "The most important causes in your life are not the ones happening around you right now. They are the ones you planted so long ago, you have completely forgotten you were the one who put them in the ground. And some of those seeds," he said, "have roots that go deeper than a single lifetime. Some causes are planted so far back in time that no single human life is long enough to trace them to their origin." Daniel heard that sentence, and I watched something happen to his face that I can only describe as a quiet unraveling. Not panic, not disbelief. Something more like the feeling you get when you realize a room you have been sitting in for years is actually much larger than the walls you could see. Marcus had just pushed on a door that Daniel did not know existed, and the draft coming through it was cold and ancient and entirely real. Let me explain what Marcus was pointing at, because it took me a long time to understand it fully myself. We had been talking about causality as if it operated on a single level, the level we can see and touch and measure. Action produces reaction, decision produces consequence, thought produces behavior. All of that is true, and all of that matters. But Marcus was describing something that the ancient teachers had always known, and that modern science is only now beginning to approach with any kind of language. That causality does not stop at the edge of the physical world. It runs deeper, through layers of existence that most people never think to examine because they are invisible to ordinary attention. He described it this way. Imagine you are looking at the surface of a very deep lake. On the surface, you can see ripples. You can watch them move, intersect, cancel each other out, amplify each other. You can study the patterns of those ripples and learn a great deal about what is happening on the water. But the ripples are not the cause of themselves. Something produced them, and that something came from below the surface, from a depth that surface observation alone cannot reach. The physical world, Marcus said, is the surface of the lake. The ripples you see there, events, circumstances, patterns, consequences, all of it is real. But the causes that produce those ripples originated at a depth that the physical plane cannot fully account for. There is a level beneath the visible where intentions travel faster than actions, where emotional states radiate outward and interact with the emotional states of others in ways that produce physical effects long before any physical contact occurs. Where what you carry inside you, the quality of your inner world, is constantly communicating with the world outside you in a language that has no words. The ancient teachers called this the plane of subtle causation, the place where the first version of every physical event is assembled before it descends into matter and becomes something you can touch. Daniel asked Marcus, and I think most of us would ask the same thing, how do you work with something you cannot see? Marcus said you start by paying attention to what you can see, because the subtle plane does not hide its effects. It shows them to you constantly. In the recurring emotional states that arrive without obvious cause. In the way certain types of people keep appearing in your life, regardless of how many times you change your address, or your profession, or your social circle. In the physical sensations that arise in your body when you are about to make a decision that conflicts with something deeper in you than conscious preference. Your body knows. It has always known. Most people have simply been too loud on the inside to hear it. I sat with that for a long time. I still sit with it. Because I can think of moments in my own life when something in my body said no, clearly, unmistakably, before my mind had finished assembling the reasons. And I can think of the times I overrode that signal because the logical case for yes was more convincing. And I can trace almost every significant difficulty in my life to one of those moments of override. The body is not separate from the causal chain. It is a part of it, a receiver and a transmitter simultaneously. What you feel physically is often the most honest report available about what is happening on the levels beneath the visible. The tension across the shoulders that arrives every time a particular conversation begins. the lightness in the chest when you are moving in a direction that aligns with something essential in you. These are not decorative sensations. They are data, and they are pointing at causes that exist on a plane deeper than the one your reasoning mind has access to. This is not mysticism for the sake of mystery. Modern physics arrived at something strikingly similar from a completely different direction. And when I first heard Marcus explain this, I did not expect science to show up in the conversation. But it did. There are things in this physical universe that influence each other across distances that should make influence impossible. Two particles, separated by vast stretches of space, with no visible connection between them, will respond to each other instantaneously when one of them is affected. Not after a signal travels between them. Instantaneously. As if the space between them does not exist in the way we assume it does. As if the separation itself is, in some deeper sense, an illusion. Scientists call this entanglement. They have measured it. They cannot fully explain it. And the honest ones will tell you that what it implies about the nature of reality is something that our current models of the physical world are not equipped to contain. Marcus did not use this as proof of anything. He used it as a doorway into the possibility that the universe is more connected, more layered, more responsive to invisible causes than the version of reality most of us were handed growing up. And if that is true, even partly, even as a working hypothesis, then the implications for how you understand your own life are staggering. Because it means that what you carry inside you is not contained inside you. It radiates. It moves through the field of your relationships, your work, your daily environment, producing effects at a distance that you may never directly observe, but that are, nonetheless, real and consequential and yours. Daniel had gone very still by this point. The kind of still that is not absence, but presence. He was not disengaging from what Marcus was saying. He was absorbing it at a level below conversation. And then Marcus introduced the word that reordered everything. The word that bridges the ancient and the modern, the visible and the invisible, the single lifetime and the vast arc of something much longer. He said, "What I have been describing has a name, and that name carries more weight and more misunderstanding than almost any other word in the human vocabulary." He said, "The name is karma." And before Daniel could react the way most people react to that word, with either dismissal or superstition, Marcus held up one hand and said, "Forget everything you think you know about it." Because what karma actually is nothing like what most people have been told. And the difference between the myth and the reality is the difference between a cage and a key. Karma is not what happened to you. Karma is what you are still doing about it, right now, without realizing it. Marcus said that, and the room seemed to contract slightly, the way rooms do when something true and heavy enters them. The bookstore had grown quieter around us. The street outside had gone dark. Someone had turned a lamp on near the back shelves, and the light it cast was amber and low. The kind of light that makes a conversation feel ancient, like it has been happening in rooms like this for a very long time. Daniel had been holding himself carefully since Marcus mentioned the word karma. You could see it in his posture, a slight guardedness, the way a person holds themselves when they expect to be told something they will have to argue against. Because most people carry a very specific picture of what karma means. A cosmic scorecard, a ledger of offenses, a universe that is keeping track and will eventually settle the account with interest. Marcus dismantled that picture methodically, and what he replaced it with was something far more interesting and far more useful. He said karma is simply the Sanskrit word for action. Nothing more dramatic than that at its root. But in its deeper meaning, it describes something precise. It describes the totality of what you set in motion, not just through your physical actions, but through the intentions behind them. And this is the part most people completely miss. The intention is not decoration around the action. The intention is the actual cause. The action is just the vehicle it travels in. He gave an example that has stayed with me. He said, imagine two people both helping a colleague through a difficult period at work. Both spending time, both offering support, both doing the same observable thing. From the outside, the actions are identical. But in one case, the person is helping because they genuinely care, and the other person's difficulty moves them. In the other case, the person is helping because they want to be seen as generous, because the reputation of being supportive serves them, because there is a subtle calculation running underneath the warmth. Same action, completely different causes being planted, and completely different effects that will eventually arrive, not necessarily in ways anyone could point to and label, but in the quality and texture of what each person's life gradually becomes. Daniel said quietly that he recognized himself in the second example, and there was no drama in how he said it, just a flat, honest recognition, the kind that costs something. I recognized myself too. I think most people would if they were paying attention. Marcus nodded and said that recognition without judgment is the beginning of everything. He was not interested in making Daniel feel worse about his past. He was interested in making him literate in the language the law was speaking to him. Because once you can read the language, he said, you stop being surprised by the sentences. And then he introduced the part of karma that changes the entire emotional weight of the concept, the part about cycles. He said that the patterns which feel most inescapable in a life are almost never punishments. They are lessons that have not yet been completed. The universe, and I am using that word loosely the way Marcus used it, not as a religious claim, but as a description of the system we are all inside, does not repeat a pattern in your life because it is cruel. It repeats a pattern because the pattern contains something you have not yet extracted from it, something you need in order to move forward. Think about a recurring theme in your own life. Not an occasional difficulty, but a pattern. The kind that shows up in different shapes and different contexts, but always carries the same emotional core. The same feeling of being dismissed. The same moment of walking away before something is finished. The same point where trust collapses in the same specific way. That pattern is not evidence that you are broken or cursed or cosmically unlucky. It is evidence that there is a lesson inside it that is still waiting to be learned. And the pattern will keep arriving, in different costumes, with different faces, in different circumstances, until the lesson is finally met directly. Daniel went quiet again. But this time, the quality of the quiet was different from the silences earlier in the evening. Earlier, he had gone quiet from shock, from the discomfort of having his story about himself disturbed. This quiet was more focused, more interior. The quiet of someone actively searching through their own history with new eyes. After a long moment, he said, "Mine is always the same moment. Every collapse, every rupture, every time something fell apart, there was a moment right before it where I could have chosen honesty, and I chose comfort instead. Every single time." He said it the way you say something you have known for a long time, but never allowed to fully form into words. Like the words themselves were the last step of a recognition that had been building for years. Marcus said, "That is not a flaw. That is your curriculum. And the fact that you can see it now, clearly, without excuses around it, means you are closer to completing it than you have ever been before." I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it is one of the most important reframes available to a human being. The idea that the recurring difficulties in your life are not evidence against you. They are the specific shape of what you are here to learn. They are not random. They are not punishment. They are the most personalized education imaginable, designed precisely around the exact lesson your particular soul needs most. That reframe does not make the difficulties easier in the moment. I want to be honest about that. When you are inside a painful pattern, it does not feel like education. It feels like suffering. But the meaning you assign to it changes everything about how you move through it, and whether you come out the other side having actually learned what it was trying to teach you. And this is where the real liberation begins. Not in the understanding of karma as a concept, but in the practical shift that understanding makes possible. Most people spend enormous energy trying to escape the effects of old causes. They change jobs, change cities, change relationships, change their appearance, change everything on the outside. And then they arrive in the new circumstances and find, with a sinking feeling that is almost darkly familiar, that the same essential dynamic has followed them there. Because you cannot outrun an effect by moving. You can only dissolve it by understanding and addressing the cause. The cause is always internal before it is external. Always. And here is where the conversation took a turn I was not prepared for. Because everything Marcus had described so far, the law, the mental plane, the subtle levels of causation, karma and its cycles, all of it had been pointing in one direction. Toward responsibility, toward agency, toward the idea that you are more involved in creating your experience than most people ever allow themselves to believe. But Daniel asked the question that I think lives at the center of all of this. The question that most people are actually asking underneath everything else when they engage with these ideas. He said, if I created all of this, and I accept that I did, then what about the things I suffered that I genuinely did not deserve? The things that were done to me. The circumstances I was born into that I had no hand in choosing. Where does responsibility end, and where does something else begin? The room was very quiet. Even the lamp in the corner seemed to hold still. Marcus looked at Daniel for a moment, and then said something that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count since that evening. Something that does not simplify the question, but that opens it into something much larger and much more honest than either victimhood or total self-blame could ever be. He said, you are asking the right question, and the answer to it is the thing that most people who encounter these ideas never reach. Because it requires you to hold two things at once that feel like opposites. And most of us were never taught how to do that. The most dangerous lie a person can believe is that their suffering has nothing to do with them, because that belief is the one thing that guarantees it never ends. Marcus said that, and I want to be careful here because it is the kind of sentence that can land wrong if it arrives without the right context around it. He was not saying that people bring suffering upon themselves through fault or weakness. He was not dismissing real harm that real people cause each other. He was pointing at something more precise and more uncomfortable than either of those things. He was pointing at the story, not the events themselves, the story we build around the events. The narrative that explains what happened, who was responsible, what it means about us and about the world, and, most importantly, what it means about what is possible for us going forward. Because that story, regardless of how accurate it is as a description of the past, becomes a cause in its own right the moment we start living inside it. Daniel had a story. It was not an unreasonable story. Parts of it were factually accurate. His partner had made decisions that contributed to the collapse. The market had shifted in ways that were genuinely outside his control. There were external factors that were real and not invented. And yet, Marcus said, the version of the story Daniel had been living inside was one in which Daniel himself appeared almost exclusively as the recipient of what others did. A man things happened to. A man circumstances defeated. And that version, however understandable its origins, was functioning as one of the most powerful causes in Daniel's life. Because a person who understands themselves primarily as someone things happen to will, without any conscious intention, keep arranging their life in ways that confirm that understanding. Not because they want to suffer, but because the story we carry about ourselves is also a blueprint. And the law does not distinguish between the blueprints we choose deliberately and the ones we inherited without realizing it. Marcus leaned forward slightly and said something I want you to really hear. He said, the opposite of victimhood is not invulnerability. It is authorship. And authorship does not begin with the future. It begins with the way you are currently narrating the past. I sat with that for a long time after that evening, because I think most of us carry at least one chapter of our lives that we have written in the passive voice, where we are the object of the sentence, not the subject, where things happened, were done, were taken, were lost, and we are simply the surface those events landed on. And the invitation Marcus was extending to Daniel and to anyone willing to hear it was not to rewrite history into something prettier or more flattering. It was to rewrite the relationship to history, to move from a position of having been shaped entirely by what happened to a position of choosing, consciously and deliberately, what you are going to do with what happened. Because that choice, that single shift in orientation, is where the causal chain either continues in the same direction or begins to bend. Daniel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The bookstore had gone almost completely quiet around us. The amber lamp in the corner was still the only warm light in the room, and it cast long, soft shadows across the shelves. Outside, the street was silent, in the way streets get very late at night, when the city has finally exhaled. He said, "I have been waiting for the people who caused damage to acknowledge it before I allowed myself to move forward, as if their recognition was the key I needed." Marcus said, "And how long have you been waiting?" Daniel said, "Years." Marcus said nothing. He did not need to, because the weight of that answer was already doing everything a response could have done. Daniel had just heard himself out loud for the first time, heard the actual cost of the position he had been holding. He had been standing at a locked door for years, waiting for someone else to produce the key, not realizing that the door opened from his side. That is the moment, that specific moment of hearing yourself clearly, not being told, not being convinced by an argument, just hearing yourself say the true thing in plain language and feeling the full weight of what it means. And the strange thing is that it did not look like collapse. It looked like relief, a complicated, slightly painful relief, the kind that comes with dropping something heavy you have been carrying for so long you forgot it was optional. This is what taking responsibility actually feels like when it arrives honestly, not like punishment, not like admission of guilt, like setting something down, like the sudden awareness of how much energy was being consumed by holding that particular story in place, and the first breath of what becomes available when you stop. Now, here is where the real work begins, because the shift in orientation is not the destination, it is the starting line. Marcus said that the moment a person genuinely moves from passenger to author, the law immediately begins to respond differently. Not because the law changed, the law never changes, but because the quality of the causes being planted changes, and different causes produce different effects. It is not more complicated than that. But it is also not less demanding than that, because the past does not vanish the moment you decide to stop being defined by it. Old causes continue producing their effects. The patterns do not dissolve overnight simply because you have recognized them. And this is where many people stumble. They have the insight, they feel the shift, they make the declaration to themselves that things are going to be different now. And then the old effects keep arriving anyway, and they take that as evidence that nothing has actually changed, that the insight was not real, that the law is indifferent to their intention. But Marcus said, this is one of the most critical misunderstandings of the entire process. He said, the arrival of old effects after a new intention has been set is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of how the law actually works. You planted seeds months or years ago. Those seeds are still producing their harvest. The fact that you have now planted different seeds does not instantly replace the harvest that was already in motion. The field needs time to turn over. The question is not whether the old effects will stop arriving. They will. The question is who you are being while they arrive, whether you are meeting them with the same unconscious patterns that created them, thereby planting the same seeds all over again, or whether you are meeting them with the new orientation, the authorship, the conscious relationship to cause, and in doing so, finally letting the old cycle complete itself,
rather than feeding it another round. Daniel looked at Marcus and said, "So, what does that actually look like in practice? Not in principle. In a specific Tuesday morning when everything is still broken and the old feelings are back and nothing has visibly changed yet." Marcus smiled, and what he said next was the most practical and the most quietly powerful thing I heard all evening. He said, "On that Tuesday morning, the work is not grand, it is small. It is the quality of your attention in the next 5 minutes."
It is what you choose to rehearse in your mind while you make your coffee. It is the intention you bring to the first conversation of the day. Not because those small things are dramatic, but because causes are always small before they are large. Every significant effect in your life began as something that looked, in the moment, like nothing much at all. He paused and then said, "The master is not the person who never faces difficulty. The master is the person who has learned to tend the field even when the harvest is not yet visible." Especially then. Daniel nodded slowly, and I could see something settling into him that had not been there at the start of the evening. Not certainty, something quieter and more durable than certainty. A direction. But Marcus had one more thing to say. The thing that I think is the most practically useful piece of everything he shared that night. And it started with a question he turned to both of us. He said, "Most people, when they understand all of this, ask how they can use the law to get what they want." And that is a reasonable question. But it is the second question. The first question, the one that makes the second one answerable, is something else entirely. And almost nobody asks it first. Most people spend their entire lives asking the wrong question, and that single mistake costs them everything. Marcus had just said that almost nobody asks the first question, the one that makes everything else answerable. And both Daniel and I were leaning forward without realizing it, the way you lean toward a flame without deciding to. He said, "Most people come to an understanding like this and immediately ask, how do I use it to get what I want? A better situation, more money, a relationship that works, health, security." And he said, that is not a bad question. It is just the second question. The one that only works after the first one has been answered honestly. The first question, he said, is this: what am I actually broadcasting right now? Not what do I want to broadcast. Not what do I intend to broadcast when I get myself sorted out. What is the quality of what I am putting into the field of my life today, in this hour, in this specific state of mind and emotion that I am actually in, rather than the one I wish I were in? He said most people approach the law like a vending machine. They input a desire, they expect an output, and when the output does not arrive, they conclude the machine is broken. But the law is not a vending machine. It is a mirror. And a mirror does not give you what you want. It gives you what you are. That sentence hit me somewhere that took days to fully process. Because it means the work of conscious causation is not primarily about strategy. It is not about technique. It is not about saying the right affirmations or taking the right actions or positioning yourself in the right circumstances. Those things matter, but they are downstream of something more fundamental. The fundamental thing is the quality of what you are actually being, moment to moment, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day when nobody is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. Marcus described it this way. He said, imagine a musician who wants to play a beautiful piece but has not yet learned to hear the notes they are actually producing. They hear the piece as they intend it, as they imagine it, as they believe they are playing it. But the instrument is producing something slightly different, and because they cannot hear the gap between intention and actual output, they cannot close it. The music they send into the room is not the music they believe they are sending. Most people, he said, are that musician. They believe they are broadcasting confidence, while fear is the actual frequency. They believe they are operating from generosity, while a quiet scarcity is doing most of the driving. They believe they have let go of the past, while the past is still the loudest voice in every decision they make. The work, the real work, is developing the ability to hear yourself accurately. Not harshly, not with the distortion of self-criticism, but clearly. The way a good sound engineer listens to a recording, not to judge it, but to understand exactly what is there so they can work with it honestly. Daniel said, "And how do you actually develop that? How do you learn to hear yourself that accurately?" Marcus said, "You start by slowing down enough to notice what happens in the space between a stimulus and your response. Most people live entirely in the reaction. Something happens and they respond, and the response feels like the only possible response, like it was not even a choice. But there is always a space between what arrives and what you do with it. Tiny at first, almost invisible, but real. And in that space is where your entire relationship to the law either changes or stays the same. He said you learn to feel the quality of your own interior state before you speak, before you decide, before you act. Not to control it artificially, but to know it honestly. Because you cannot consciously plant a seed you cannot see, and you cannot see a seed you are moving too fast to notice. The lamp in the corner of the bookstore flickered once and steadied. Outside, a car moved slowly down the empty street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window and then gone. The three of us sat in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable. The kind that has substance to it, like the silence after a piece of music ends, and nobody wants to speak yet because the air is still carrying something. Daniel picked up his glass of water, the same one he had been holding when I first sat down next to him, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Marcus and said, "I have been so focused on what I lost that I have not once asked myself what I was putting in the ground while I had it." Marcus said, "That question is worth more than everything you lost." And I believed him. I still do. Because that question is the one that changes the direction of the causal chain. Not the grand declaration, not the dramatic turning point. Just that question, asked honestly, without defense, in the quiet of an ordinary moment. What am I putting in the ground, right now? In the way I am thinking about this situation, in the intention behind this action, in the emotional frequency I am sustaining hour after hour without examining it. That question, asked consistently, is the most powerful tool available to a human being who wants to work consciously with the law. Because it keeps your attention where the actual cause lives, not in the past, which is already done. Not in the imagined future, which does not yet exist. In the present moment, which is the only place where a new cause can actually be planted. This is what Marcus meant by mastery. Not control over outcomes, not immunity from difficulty, but the disciplined, patient, honest practice of tending the inner field. Of knowing what you are actually growing before you are surprised by what arrives at the harvest. And that practice begins at the smallest possible scale. Not with the enormous decisions, with the quality of attention you bring to the next 5 minutes. Now I want to tell you what happened to Daniel. Not immediately, not in a dramatic single moment, but over time. Because the law does not work in dramatic single moments. It works the way a river works, consistently, patiently, gradually reshaping everything it moves through. Several months passed after that evening in the bookstore. I ran into Marcus occasionally, and he would mention Daniel briefly, not with details, but with the tone of someone watching a process unfold at its own pace. Then one afternoon, Daniel called me and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. His voice had a different quality than the last time I had heard it. Not lighter exactly, more settled, like a frequency that had found its proper pitch. We met at a small place near the harbor, the kind where the tables are outside and you can smell the salt water on the wind and hear the low sound of boats shifting against the dock in the distance. He looked different. Not dramatically different, Not the kind of transformation that makes a story feel too convenient. Just a person who had been carrying something for years and had finally set it down and was still adjusting to the new weight of his own body without it. He had started a new project, smaller than what he had lost, more deliberate. He had reached out to two people he had burned bridges with and had conversations that did not resolve everything, but opened something that had been sealed. His health was improving, not because he had found a cure, but because he had stopped pouring energy into the specific internal war that had been depleting him. And he said something to me over that coffee that I have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "I did not rebuild what I had. I built something I actually understand now, something I know the foundations of, because this time I watched what I was putting in the ground." He said it without pride, without the performance of someone presenting their transformation. Just a man describing what had changed in plain language. I asked him what the hardest part had been. He did not hesitate. He said, "Accepting that the law did not owe me a faster turnaround just because I finally understood it. That the seeds I planted in the months after that bookstore evening were still small and still underground while I was waiting to see if any of this was real." Learning to tend a field when there is nothing visible yet. That was the hardest part. That is the hardest part for all of us. The invisible season. The period between planting and harvest, when you have changed the causes, but the effects have not yet caught up. When everything on the surface still looks the same as before, and the only thing different is what you know is in the ground. Most people give up in that season. They conclude that the change did not work, that the insight was not real, that the law is indifferent. And so they go back to the old patterns, the old frequencies, the old causes, and the old effects reliably return, and the cycle continues. The ones who do not give up are not the ones with more talent or more intelligence or better circumstances. They're the ones who understood, deeply enough to hold on to it during the invisible season, that the harvest is always the delayed reflection of the field, that what is coming has already been decided by what was planted, and that the work of the present moment is not to force the future into arriving faster, but to ensure that what is being planted right now is worth waiting for. I think about that enormous loom I described at the very beginning, the one weaving in all directions, every thread connected to every other. And I think about what it means to take your place at that loom consciously, not to control the whole pattern, that is not available to any single person, but to know the thread you are holding, to know its color and its weight and the intention you are weaving it with. Because that thread is yours, and the part of the pattern it produces is your responsibility and your contribution and, ultimately, your life. The law does not ask whether you are ready. It does not wait for you to understand it before it runs. It is running right now, through every thought you are having, every emotional state you are sustaining, every intention you are carrying consciously or unconsciously into the next moment. The only question is whether you are working with it or being moved by it without knowing it. Here is the moral of everything I have shared with you. The life you are living is not happening to you. It is being produced by you, mostly from levels of yourself you have not yet examined. The pain, the patterns, the recurring walls, none of it is evidence against you. It is information. It is the field showing you what has been planted. And the moment you are willing to look at that information honestly, without defense and without self-destruction, you become something the law responds to differently. Not because you earned a reward, but because you finally started planting something different. And now, I want to ask you something directly. Something I want you to sit with and answer honestly. Not for me, but for yourself. Think about the one pattern in your life that keeps returning no matter what you do. The one situation that arrives in different forms, but always carries the same feeling at its core. Now ask yourself, what have you been putting in the ground that keeps growing that exact thing? Write your answer in the comments. Not the easy answer, the real one. Because the people who answer that question honestly, right now, in this moment, are the ones who are actually ready to change the field. If this conversation moved something in you, if it opened a door you did not know was there, please subscribe and leave a like. It is what allows this kind of content to keep reaching the people who need it most. And I genuinely believe the person who needs this is already on their way here.